there's no water. Carol has graciously Goodwood's golf cart over, and she can transport people to the carriage house bathrooms. But it's an easy walk as well. Is anybody not familiar with where the carriage house is? Okay, so you just kind of follow along this path and go and Rick, do you need to use the restroom? Okay. All right, so anyway.
Just had to like raise your hand, get my picture on.
Yeah, there you go. Raise your hand and
Oh, no, that's to be quiet.
potty break, potty break. All right. Yeah, and there is water on the table and ice. You just can't get any water on the top. Are we, I think maybe just a couple minutes early, but we'll go ahead and start. Welcome everybody. It's been such a pleasure to see some old familiar faces. Jerry, who used to serve on our board for many years, it's such a delight to see you. We're so glad you're here. And my friend Chip from the Museum of Art History. So many familiar faces, my wonderful volunteers, so many of you. We're just so happy you're here. And one of my new volunteers starts tomorrow. I'm happy to have him as well. My name is Marie Prentice, and I have been your president for 11 years now. No, I am stepping down. This is my last season as president past.
Oh, there it'll follow Paul.
No, it won't. No, it won't, Harriet. It's gonna. We got somebody good to follow in our shoes, and we're gonna help him get started. And you will meet him at our first meeting in the fall. Now, this is very important. We are moving to the third Tuesday of every month, because our incoming president is a philatelist, and he meets the second Tuesday of every month with his stamp club. So, which Jerry is part of. So, we're going to accommodate him by moving it to the third Tuesday, same time, same place, different day. And we will let you know. We will send emails to make sure you're aware of that. So that is a very big change, and I cannot thank Goodwood enough for hosting us. Ever since post-COVID, when we came back, they have graciously allowed us to use the Jubilee Cottage for next to nothing. And we thank Fred for being an integral part of arranging that.
It's a family and friends break.
We did Goodwood.
That's right.
So I would like to take this opportunity to thank my board, Fred Gaskey, and my husband Guy in the background, and and our wonderful treasurer who has served since the inception of PAST, since 26 years. How many years has it? 27 years?
Yeah.
27 years. And Hank is one of the ones who got PAST off the ground, and he keeps wanting to retire, but we keep not letting him, and we keep reining him in, and we just cannot thank him enough for being treasurer. And I would like to thank Carol, who has stepped up to do all the things that just got too much for us to handle. She's doing our membership. She's learning how to do Facebook. She's never been a Facebook person, but she's doing it. She's taking care of our website. So thank you so much, Carol, for stepping up to the plate for that. And last but certainly not least, Lonnie Mann, who is the absolute backbone of PAST and has been for many, many years. He's the one who's kept this thing going. We've all wanted to run away and hide, and Lonnie says, no, we have to do this. It's so important to keep track of these historical resources that are lost every time a new development goes in. We still are trying, despite Lonnie and Fred's best efforts, to get a city county archaeologist. And we feel like we're taking baby steps and only to get pushed back. And I just cannot thank you enough, Lonnie, for all that you have done for PAST and for historic preservation in Leon County.
That's a little over the top. First off, it's not true that our new president is a philanderer. He's a but I think all of us on the board want to thank Marie for her years of really hard and smart work, keeping us on track. And
That's not an easy job.
and it's not an easy job, but how many years, Marie, have you?
11 years as president.
As
but
president,
been on
yeah, 11 years as president,
A
which
little
is,
longer.
but anyway.
Okay, so we have the summer hiatus coming up, so we will not be meeting in July or August, but we will have our fall kickoff in September. So please keep an eye on your emails for that. And I think that's it. So without further ado, let me introduce our last speaker of the season. Victoria Vick Hayes is a PhD student at the University of Florida. She received her bachelor's degree at the University of North Florida under Keith Ashley. And well, many of us know Keith. He has given multiple presentations to past over the years. He's doing wonderful work. He's a leading expert in the very unique archaeology of the region of Florida where he is working. And so we're delighted to have Vic, his student, who is now at the University of Florida. And she just finished her MA at UF and is going to she is going on to continue her PhD studies there. So now Jeff mentioned one of our board members isn't here tonight, but he suggested that that when we're looking for speakers that we reach out to the University of Florida. And so I reached out to Ken Sassman, who is at the Department of Anthropology at UF, and he put out an email and Vic was the only one who responded. But since then I've heard one about her, and we are just delighted to have you this evening. Welcome, Vic Hayes.
Hi, so like Marie just said, I'm a former student of Dr. Keith Ashley's. I still work with him a lot. He was a phenomenal mentor. And this project I'm about to talk to you about actually started when I was still an undergrad at UNF, and then it kind of spiraled into this 3-year-long project that just finished this past, the previous summer. So when I was in undergrad, I was searching for a project to do for my undergraduate honors thesis, and we started flipping through things. I was interested in the St. John's II period, which is also what Keith primarily does. And we're just flipping through the site files because I was interested in doing some testing of my own and then analyzing stuff and maybe synthesizing it. So we found this one site called Cedar Point North, and it's on the southern end of Black Hammock Island. And we found that there's been very limited testing there, and all of the reports that exist of it said that there were all of these mounded shell formations there, that there were just piles and piles of mounded shell. So that really piqued our interest because shell mounds at this time is pretty atypical, both of the area and the time period. So we were immediately kind of intrigued about this site. So before I kind of get into the site itself, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what the St. John's II phase is in northeastern Florida to kind of contextualize what I'm talking about. The St. John's II phase in northeastern Florida spans from about 940 to 1300 CE. It originated actually in the Middle St. John's, and in the Middle St. John's, it is much older and has a much more longer time span than it does in far northeastern Florida. And many of you may know Mount Royal, or at least have heard the name Mount Royal. It's like the infamous civic ceremonial complex in the Middle St. John's that dates to this time period. About around 940 CE, we see that some of the communities in the Middle St. John's undertook a northward migration. So they traveled downriver to far northeastern Florida, and they established a second civic ceremonial center called the Mill Cove Complex. In terms of this migration, it was not a full send migration. Not everyone from the Middle St. John's migrated north, only certain communities did and certain groups. And all of the evidence points towards this migration being entirely strategic and intentional. They were not pushed out of the area. They weren't rejecting anything that was happening in the area. What it was most likely caused by is that around 940 CE, when this migration took place, it coincides perfectly with the onset of the Mississippian period and the Mississippian phenomenon. So in the broader Southeast at this time, we see all of these extra local long distance interaction networks kind of popping up all over the Southeastern and Midwest United States. And what we find at Mount Royal is that they were actively engaging in these networks pretty much from the get-go. So they were having all of these non-local contacts from as far away as Cahokia, which was kind of forming at this time. And we're finding all of these exotic items there. Well, at the same time, all of these interior groups are now, they're wanting more and more shell. They're wanting like these coastal whelks and shell beads. So one of the main pull factors of this migration was probably traveling to an area where all of these resources would be readily accessible to them. At the same time, this far northeastern Florida around 940 was not densely populated. It was fairly sparsely populated by really small communities that appear to have been assimilated after the arrival of St. John's communities from the Middle St. John's. So it was kind of an ideal scenario for them to travel here, kind of construct a second civic ceremonial center and maintain cultural continuity with their homeland all at the same time. So it kind of spearheads these non-local interaction networks in this area, but at the same time, they're still keeping close contact with Mount Royal. They're traveling back and forth, and they're maintaining a very distinct cultural continuity. In terms of typical St. John's assemblages, we find a lot of check stamp pottery. We also find plain pottery, but all of it's tempered with sponge spicules, so the endoskeletons of freshwater sponges. So if you look under the microscope at St. John's pottery, you'll see all of the little endoskeletons in the paste. And then there are also fisher hunter-gatherers. So when people think of the Mississippian period, they normally think of agriculturalist and chiefdom level societies that are very hierarchical. We don't really see any of this in this area. They maintained their fisher hunter-gatherer lifestyle. There's no evidence that points to them being overly hierarchical like a lot of interior chiefdoms were at that time. And we actually don't see corn in the area until about 1450. So St. John's two sites a lot of the times have shell middens, not necessarily raised piles of shell, but shell middens beneath the ground. We find spiculate tempered pottery, and then we also find other types of pottery, which I'll talk about later, but we find out mulgi that's coming from South Central Georgia. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But like I said, this is kind of what the broader Mississippian world looks like at this time. And these are all of the things that we are getting at the Mill Cove Complex, and also Mount Royal has all of these. So obviously we're exporting shell. We're probably their kind of primary contact for exporting shell beads at this time. And then we're also finding galena, copper, mica, and like basalt, silt, greenstone artifacts. And then this is the Mill Cove Complex. So what happened was Keith was very interested in this time period, and in the UNF Archaeology Lab, one of the ongoing large projects is called the Mill Cove Complex Project, and it's centered on this time period, investigating these non-local ties and kind of investigating the lifeways of these people. The Mill Cove Complex, which is that civic ceremonial center they established, is an outstanding site. It's what I'm doing my dissertation on, and it's just a very dazzling archaeological site to investigate. This is kind of the central ceremonial hub at the time. So this is where we're getting all of those non-local artifacts. That being said, we don't want to take this myopic view of St. John's two lifeways. So while the Mill Cove Complex has produced a lot of really valuable information about the ceremonial life and these extravagant rituals that were being had at this time, it's not telling us the full story. So part of the Mill Cove Complex project is to investigate other St. John's two sites in the region, investigate villages or temporary habitation sites to really see how these people were living on a day-to-day basis instead of just these huge, ceremonial centers. And that's where Cedar Point North comes in, as it was one of these. So Mill Cove is right here. These are other St. John's two sites. And then Cedar Point North kind of pops up and we don't know much about it. There's been very limited archaeology done. So we decided to look for some LiDAR of it. This is the first LiDAR that we saw of the site. So LiDAR is taken with a drone or a plane, and what happens is it shoots like billions of little points out that permeate the trees because of how many points they're shooting out, but it bounces back from surfaces, and then you can get an XYZ coordinate. And then from those, you can kind of code and make these topographic maps. So right here, you can see all of these little red or like raised formations. All of those are the shell formations on this site. So we were pretty taken away. This one right here, which I have better LiDAR of this later, but this one right here is almost 200 meters long, running north-south along the marsh edge. There's this cluster right here, and we were just kind of blown away that there's been no work done at this site, or limited work. Uh-oh. Here, I have to use the computer. So this is just more.
Yeah, it's a bad juju, just in this.
So this is more LiDAR of the site. Our excavations actually just focus on the southern half of the site. It was just way too much to do. But it started as an undergraduate honors thesis project. So we went out to the site, we dug one test unit, and we dug 7 small shovel tests. And then it kind of just spiraled into this multi-year-long project with the National Park Service. This is located on the Timucuan Ecological Historic Preserve in Jacksonville, Florida. So working with the National Park Service, they were also kind of invested in this because they wanted to know more about the history of the land that they own. And we actually ended up holding 2 UNF field schools there, which is a 6-week field school over the summer. You can see more right here. These are blown up, just larger, that these almost kind of parallel each other, both in like size and shape, as well as this one over here. So they kind of have these apexes and then linear ridges coming off of them. So we went to the site and we kind of did a walkthrough, and seeing them in person was even more spectacular, and we decided that we definitely needed to test here. But that being said, I should say that these pale in comparison to the shell works in the Middle St. John's and the Gulf Coast. So when people normally think of shell works, they think of these massive, archaic, monumental architecture that was constructed about 4,000 years ago. This is 1,000 years ago. This is the scale. About 4 of those could fit into one of these. But that being said, again, this is really unique for this time period and in this region. So that's why it was so interesting. In terms of previous archaeology, John Goggin in the 1950s first reported this site, and he did some surface collection, but all he really said was that he found St. John's pottery and that there was just a ton of shell formations everywhere. This was later corroborated by Scott Knighty in 1976, who was a state archaeologist, and he also just kind of looked at the site, did a walkthrough, and said Goggin was right. The only testing that has been done on the site was by Mike Rousseau in the 1990s. So after the National Park Service acquired this land, they contracted out Mike Rousseau to do just testing all throughout all of this land that they just acquired. He dug a few shovel tests, transects, 12 of them were positive. He dug 2 test units that were 1.5 by 1.5 meters. But interestingly, out of all of the tests that he did on this island, only 1 was actually located on a shell formation. So all of the rest were located off shell. So still, even though we reanalyzed all of Rousseau's stuff and we looked at it, none of it was really dug into the shell formation. So we were just curious as to what was in them. Is it dating only to the St. John's 2 period? Is it multi-component? Were these built up over a really long period of time? So to date, we have dug 40 units at the site, 52 shovel tests, and then total station mapping of everything. So this is just a little map showing all of our shovel test transects and then the different areas that we excavated in. And you can see right here, this pile of backfill shell that we're pulling out of these things is just an insane amount of oyster shell. And we also decided right off the bat that we were actually going to name all of these formations Timucuan words. So going from south to north, we have Sakali, which means oyster. We have Mellow, which means shellfish. Yapi, which means palmetto. Sitala, which means spider. Eola, which is that really long one, which means snake, because it kind of looks like it's snaking up the marsh. And then I'm not sure if you can see Muku right here is a really small one. We decided we wanted to excavate. We did a big block off shell to look for like placemaking activities. So this little shell mound right here is called Muku, which means eye. And the basic project goals are really simple. The first is just establishing a site chronology. So who was here, when were they here, and how long were they here? The second is construction methods. So how were these shell formations first constructed? Were they constructed relatively quickly over a very short period of time? Or was it something that built up over 1,000 years or so? And then the third is subsistence and seasonality. So analyzing, getting Dr. Jacqueline Meyer, who is a zooarchaeologist at UNF, getting her and her students to analyze all of the faunal remains we're getting out of here to kind of investigate whether people were here full-time or only part-time by looking at the seasonality of the fish. And then managerial recommendations. So one of the first things we noticed when we were actually walking through this site is that there are some shell formations really close to the marsh edge that were just kind of tumbling down the marsh edge because of all of the tidal activity happening. So managerial recommendations just for the National Park Service for kind of like future conservation of the site. But our ultimate project goals kind of fit in with the Mill Cove Complex project. So kind of the broader scope of things is contextualizing the Cedar Point North site within the St. John's 2 region. How does it articulate with all of these other sites? How does it relate to the Mill Cove complex? The second is exploring harvesting and the purpose of shell mound construction. Are these just simple domestic refuse piles? A lot of times in archaeology, we get this midden versus monument argument, where it's either just a simple household midden that's just disposed garbage piled up over a long period of time, or it's monumental architecture. So we're kind of trying to tease that out as well. And again, that's kind of a binary that we've imposed. It can be both at the same time. So that was one of the main things we were also wanting to investigate. And then we total station mapped a lot of these. There's me 3 years ago with our total station, whose name is Ripley. And total stations are great because I showed you that LiDAR earlier. But the LiDAR, the best LiDAR that you can get, like free access, is only 1 meter accuracy. And a lot of these shell mounds are a little smaller, so we can't really see the detail of them. Total station kind of just gives you the ability to map it by hand using a machine. So I have a little rod that has a prism on it, and I click a button and this machine shoots out a laser, and then it bounces off the rod and back at the machine. And then you get the same XY coordinates that way, but you're able to get a lot more detail compared to LiDAR. So I'm just going to go through everything that we've kind of done real quick. So this is a total station map. So this is what I generated by just doing all of those points with the machine. But this is Sakali. And again, you can see it has this mounded apex, and then it has this little curved little thing going off of it, and it has this longer ridge, which is about 33 meters going east-west. And then there it is in LiDAR. You can kind of see the comparison of how much more detailed this is compared to that up there. And we dug one 1x2 meter unit, 1 shovel test in the apex, and then 7 shovel tests on the perimeter. Mellow is just a little north of Sakali, probably only about 20 meters north of it. And we dug 1 shovel test and 1 1x2 meter unit. These are probably about 1 meter off the ground. So they're only about 3 feet high, but it's still pretty crazy to see in person. Yapi, which means palmetto, we dug this 1 by 10 meter trench through it because we wanted to get a really good idea of the stratigraphy from its lowest point to its highest point. And then we dug 2 units, both one on each end and then 1 unit off shell, just to kind of explore what's going on right beside all of these shell formations. Satala, which is the spider, this is right next to Yapi. So Yapi's right here, Satala's right here. They look almost identical, except Satala has these little nodes coming off of it. We were not able to total station map this because it was covered in way too much vegetation that would take way too long to clear. But we dug one 1x6 meter trench in the center as well, and there's some students up there excavating it. And then finally, we have Eola. Again, like I said before, this is one of the ones that's undergoing major erosion because of the tidal activity. It's super close to the marsh edge. This is the marsh edge right here, and then this is Eola. This is a photo where you can see the shell just kind of eroding or caving in on itself. And then this is one of the shovel tests that we dug, and this is the water table. So pretty much maybe 30 or 40 centimeters down, it just started overflowing with water. So this was one of the priorities that we decided we really need to work on. First, we dug 3 shovel tests, one at the southern apex, the middle, and then the northern apex. And then we decided that this is just way too big of a shell formation to sample. So we decided for the time being to just work on the southern half. We've dug 2 1x4 meter trenches, and then 2 1x2 meter trenches, one in the apex, which if you can believe it, we dig in 10 centimeter levels, and this unit went down 15 levels. So we were well beyond a meter deep. It was crazy to dig in. And then finally, because we wanted to explore not just the shell formations, but what's happening outside of them, we dug a big block next to Muku, which is the eye. It's made of 18 units. There's one 1x1 and the rest are 1x2s. And then another block here. We chose this location because of our shovel test survey. So those results kind of guided us. The shovel test, which you can see up there, it says shovel test 36. That one just produced a lot of St. John's pottery. So we thought that this is a prime location to dig. And then this shovel test right here may have had like a pit feature in it. So we decided to dig a block there, a smaller block, but a block there as well. Because we really want to investigate placemaking activities and whether there's any potential structures here. Because obviously maybe the shell formations are for one specific activity, but we want to explore all of the activities at this site. Just starting with general results, this is what, this was that long 1x10 meter trench. This is the stratigraphy and the cross section of it. I don't know if you can see up there, but this is represented by the Roman numeral 3 here. All of this is just jumbled oyster shell. We had to warn students when we were out there that if they bump into the wall, that whole wall is just going to cave in. So jumbled oyster shell normally indicates that things were built up very, very quickly instead of over time. So if things were built up over a long period of time, what would happen is they would deposit shell, and then people would walk on it, or animals would walk on it, or they would wait however many years, and that shell would kind of consolidate, and it would be just consolidated more and more over time. So if we excavated this and it was built up over a very long period of time, the shells would be more packed together. But all of these shells are so incredibly jumbled that it seems to right off the bat indicate that maybe these were built up very quickly rather than longer. These are just some more photos right here. You may be able to see it better. But that general area right there, you kind of see like all of these huge voids in the shell. Again, that indicates that they may have just been dumping things very quickly. And then shell formation pottery totals. So we're getting a lot of ceramic artifacts out of it. Not surprisingly, it is mostly St. John's. So St. John's pottery represents over 70% of the count and weight. Sandy St. John's is just an arbitrary thing that I designate as equal parts sand tempered and sponge spicule tempered. And then we're getting some ocmulgee, which I'll talk more about this later. Ocmulgee we see in most St. John's 2 assemblages. They make up about 5 to 25%. We're getting incredibly low numbers for St. John's 2 site at Cedar Point North. And then we're also getting some San Marcos and San Pedro, which dates to the 16th and 17th century. But just to the south of Cedar Point North, there's a Mission Gualakini, and that's probably where this is coming from. This is only found in the very upper parts of the shell formations, so they were just very likely just kind of dropped as they were there. The Muku, the block results that we dug off shell, I hate to say it, were relatively disappointing in general. We were expecting to find amazing features that maybe were indicative of a structure or like more complex site activities rather than just shell mounding, because it's obvious that they're shell mounding. We only found 7 features. None of them were definitively St. John's 2. So what we did find, and Rousseau's previous survey also found this, was that this is a multi-component site. So we're finding a bunch of different pottery types off of shell. We found 7 features, but all of them either had a bunch of different pottery types mixed in with it, or they had no artifacts at all. So it was kind of hard to say whether or not those features were even dating to this time period or if they were later. And then there was just some light shell scattered throughout the block. But these are what this was the best feature we found, and it was probably like some sort of post. This is another feature map kind of showing, we have all of these areas, which are just these kind of faint stains in the ground that can be upgraded to features if they become something larger. And then these are kind of the 7 over here. And again, like I said, for the pottery totals for the block, we have a bunch of different pottery types represented. St. John's is the earliest that we found, which means that when people were at this site initially building these shell mounds, they were building it on sterile land. They were likely or possibly targeting an area that had no evidence of prior human occupation, which I'll also touch on later. But then we also have later pottery types. We have St. Mary, San Pedro, San Marcos. Again, those last 2 are probably related to that mission site just south. And then we have some non-diagnostic sand-tempered pottery. And even though we're finding all these pottery types, this is a distribution map. St. John's 2 is still predominantly what is represented. We're getting plain, we're getting that typical check stamped, and then we're also getting things like cord marked or woven. And then this is what the San Pedro and San Marcos looks like. San Pedro is grog tempered. Again, these are later wares. This is when they started growing corn in Florida, so around 1450. That would be when San Pedro pottery is there. And then we have the San Marcos, which is line blocked with a central dot, which is that upper left one. But what's really interesting is all of the artifacts at this site taken together and kind of trying to start interpreting these. So a lot of the pottery right off the bat, it's mostly spall, which means when the surface separates from the rest of the sherd. That happens a lot of the time when it's intensively used over a fire, so like a cooking pot. It can be cracked, which is also indicative of thermal damage. And almost all of them are very highly eroded. Check stamp dominates. We don't have a lot of variability in the pottery assemblage here, and it's very unlike any other St. John's 2 site that we've really seen in this region. So even though we're not finding a lot of these really cool looking pottery types like the St. John's incised and punctated, it's interesting because of the lack of variability. So we only have 3 incised and punctated. One of them isn't even St. John's. This is sand tempered. And we have less than 2% Okmulgee pottery, which again is very rare. Most St. John's assemblages have 15 to 25%. So when we start to kind of look at pottery function, I like to take on a techno-functional approach, which is when you look at kind of the not only just the decorations, but the actual surface treatment of pottery. You look at the interiors and exteriors. And a lot of the times, these little marks that are easily overlooked can actually tell you what the pot was used for. So for cooking, a lot of the times pottery will have soot on it, obviously, but it'll also have a lot of attrition on the interior, probably from them stirring something and the spoon scraping the inside. And then also you have like storage, serving, and transport. If people were living at this site year round, we would expect to see pottery types that represent all of these functions. We would expect to see serving vessels, and we would expect to see storage vessels for, any sort of liquid or like grinding up certain nuts. And then we'd also expect to see transportation vessels because of all these non-local interactions they're having. But at Cedar Point North, it looks like almost all of the pottery is all indicative of cooking pots and nothing else. And it's relatively uniform both in the shell formations and off of the shell formations. So in that big block that we dug. So all of that San Marcos and San Pedro and St. Mary's pottery we found in that block looks pretty pristine in terms of its like surface treatment, but then all of the St. John's is just heavily worn. And again, now talking about Okmulgee, it makes up 5 to 25% of assemblages. Dr. Keith Ashley and Neil Wallace actually did neutron activation analysis on pottery. So for anyone who doesn't know, neutron activation analysis is a type of, we can send it to the University of Missouri, and what they do is they bombard a small piece of pottery with a bunch of like radiation waves, and then you can actually analyze the chemical composition and see where the clay is from that the pot was made with. So they did a bunch of neutron activation analysis on Okmulgee pottery, and they found that it's both being exported from South Central Georgia to Florida, but it's also being made locally. But you can't tell, you can only tell on this neutron activation on the chemical composition level whether or not it's local or non-local. Which to them, because of that, they hypothesized that maybe Okmulgee women from South Central Georgia were moving in, bringing their paste and their pottery technology with them and making it here, because it's such a complex recipe to just replicate or imitate. In terms of non-ceramic artifacts, again, this assemblage is pretty mind-blowing because we're not finding that many. If they were living here year-round, we would expect to see, although stone isn't local to northeastern Florida, the closest area is probably Gainesville. We still see stone artifacts when they live in year-round villages. We would expect to see a lot of modified shells being used as hammers and stuff. We're not finding that many of those. We have one possible bone pin fragment, a piece of modified sandstone, and then one basalt salt fragment, which was found in that block. Interestingly, the only other site that we know of that has kind of a similar assemblage to this is the other major shell formation site dating to the St. John's Tube period in northeastern Florida. And it is the Grand Shell Ring, which is located on Big Talbot Island, which is just adjacent to Black Hammock Island. So Keith Ashley has also worked here previously. And what he found is that there's also an incredibly low amount of Okmulgee pottery in the shell formation here. So that kind of parallels Cedar Point North. It also, Rawlins is on an adjacent island as well. And Rawlins dates to the Archaic period. And it is a massive shell ring. It's the biggest shell ring, and it's the oldest shell ring in the southeast on the Atlantic coast. And what we think, and what he has hypothesized, is that when they made that migration here from the Middle St. John's, they were wanting to imprint their homeland where they were living near all of these archaic shell formations in the Middle St. John's. They're wanting to imprint that in far northeastern Florida because there's not that many shell formations here. The only major shell formation in far northeastern Florida is Rawlins, so it seems almost like they're co-opting or commemorating the past by adopting this shell mounting practice, and they almost emulated the ring with the Grand Shell Ring, so it almost looks like one of these little ringlets hinging off of Rawlins. But both the Grand Shell Ring and Cedar Point North have really low amounts of Okmulgee pottery. Keith hypothesized, at least for the Grand Shell Ring, that they were almost creating a space for a specific shared identity. And maybe that meant not bringing in all of these non-local items like Okmulgee pottery or all of this exotica coming from the interior. So could they possibly also be doing that at Cedar Point North? Moving on to the faunal analysis, like I said before, Dr. Jacqueline Meyer and her students at UNF did some of the faunal analysis for 4 of the shell formations. And they found that it is almost exclusively over 80% fish. That's not that surprising for St. John's sites. A lot of the time they are mostly fishers over like hunters. We found some small mammals, but it was mostly fish. And it was also almost exclusively catfish. Interestingly, she actually measured or approximated the size of the catfish. And all of the catfish, one, were very large, and all of them were also almost about the same size from all of the NISP catfish that she found. So that could mean two things. It could mean either they're gathering them seasonally, and that's why we're only finding one size, or they're using advanced fishing technology, or they're making some sort of net where smaller fish can swim through, but it'll only catch the larger fish.
Which type of catfish? Agrimarinus or probably not sailor?
I'm not entirely sure because this is what Dr. Meyer gave me, and I'm not a zooarchaeologist. And then moving on, this is actually the second most well-dated St. John's 2 site in Northeast Florida now. We got over 14 radiocarbon dates for it. I did some Bayesian statistics on all of these dates, which is just a fancy statistical program on OxCal where you can throw a bunch of dates in and it'll kind of minimize or approximate about how long the site was used for. That's probably more accurate than if you just average them all out. And it does seem like the site dates to 1120 to 1280, which again, the St. John's 2 period starts in 940. So this was probably in the latter half, right before they actually migrated back to the Middle St. John's in 1300. But more importantly, a lot of these dates either are completely identical to one another or overlap at like the 90% level. So for a lot of these, what we did is we radiocarbon dated the top level of the shell formations and we radiocarbon dated the deepest level of the shell formations to see about how long these built up for. We got multiple dates back from the top and bottom level, which are separated by about a meter of shell, and they're identical dates. So what this is telling us is that all of these are probably built up very, very quickly, and then they're probably all kind of being built around the same time. So I contacted, he's on my committee at the University of Florida, Dr. Ken Sassman. I was interested because I know that a lot of the stuff in the Gulf Coast as well as in the Middle St. John's, a lot of those older archaic shell formations are aligned with the solstices. And in the Middle St. John's, prior to their migration, they were living near these archaic shell formations. So again, like the Grand Shell Ring, they could be commemorating the past and starting to engage in this older practice. But I was also wondering, are they also aligning these with the solstices the same way that populations 2,000 years prior were? And what we found is that they were. The apex or the highest point of almost all of these shell formations are aligned with either the rising summer, this is an error, make that winter, either the rising summer solstice or the rising winter solstice. So you have all of these high points. They were citing all of these things with cosmological intentions. And this was pretty incredible. And then we started to kind of go down this rabbit hole of, oh, well, are they doing this elsewhere? And if you remember that LiDAR I showed you of Mill Cove, where they have those two gigantic mortuary monuments, that is aligned with the winter solstice. And then the Grand Shell Ring in one of those mortuary monuments is aligned with the summer solstice. So now we're seeing this on a much broader site scale throughout this whole region. The Cedar Point North, at the smaller scale, they're aligning these smaller formations with the solstice, but they're also aligning their sites with the solstices. And I'm also not fully convinced some of these things that aren't aligned with them, I think could possibly be aligned with stars that it's very difficult to calculate. So this, looking at solstice alignments are incredibly easy now, because the sun, the degree that the sun rises has changed by 0.001 degree from 1,000 years ago to now. So it's been very minor. And they're not out there with calculators calculating the exact degree. They're just doing it via eyesight. But most of the other stars that are a lot farther away, they have changed significantly in terms of like the angle that we see them at and what time we see them of the year. So this is just very basic level. And I'm not trying to sound like kooky up here saying that they're thinking about the stars all the time, but I do think that this is incredibly reasonable. We know that these people are engaging in these non-local interactions with places like Cahokia, It's been found that a lot of the Cahokian mounds are aligned with the solstices. So this also could be part of engaging in this kind of broader religious cosmological movement permeating throughout the Southeast as well. So just some important points to consider. Cedar Point North does look like it is a multi-component site, although the shoal formations look like they are exclusively St. John's 2, and St. John's 2 is the earliest component of that site. So they are building this site on sterile ground. The second is the incredible lack of ceramic diversity that we see. We're not seeing the fine wares, we're not seeing mulgi, we're seeing plain and check stamped, and we're seeing them highly eroded throughout the site. Lack of non-ceramic artifacts. Again, if they were living here full time, we would expect to see stone tools and shell tools. We're not seeing any of that. We're just seeing pots that look like they were probably used for cooking or intensive activities used over fire. The stratigraphy and the radiocarbon dates are indicative of a rapid buildup. They were built up very quickly, probably over a relatively short period of time. And these shoal formations were built in accordance with celestial events in mind. So all of this has kind of come to this argument that I have been trying to make, that Cedar Point North was not habited year-round. This is not a living place. You would think that based on our testing that we did off-shell, we would find something indicative of them living there. Seasonality isn't pointing to them living there. One of Keith's other students, Chance Courtney Durrett at UNF, actually did a study on, we took out a column sample in one of the shell formations, which is just a little 30 by 30 centimeter square that we dig out in levels and fine screen in the lab. But he measured all of the oyster shells, and you would think if they were living there and exploiting these oysters so much, because I cannot emphasize enough that there's probably millions of oysters out here. If they were exploiting the oyster population year round, you would think that the oysters would get smaller over time. And if they weren't getting smaller, then you would expect some form of mariculture, because we do see evidence in some places of them culling oysters or them doing intentional things to kind of repopulate the oyster population. We're not seeing any of that. So we're seeing no evidence of overexploitation, but we're also seeing no evidence of mariculture. So the catfish are all the same size, which indicates possibly seasonal gathering. The oysters with no evidence of mariculture indicate seasonal gathering because they're not getting smaller. The shell formations built up rapidly, the lack of non-ceramic artifacts and the lack of diversity, I think all points to this site not being a village, but being a seasonal gathering place for multiple St. John's communities in the region to partake in these shell mounting activities. The physical features are reflecting like this communal identity and memory that they have. So again, they were living near these archaic shell formations in Middle St. John's. It's almost like they're imprinting their homeland onto this new landscape on sterile ground. They may be trying to, the sterile ground thing may be because they're trying to make it seem like they have always been there. They're kind of establishing themselves in this region. And also, I think that Cedar Point North very likely is a site that transcends the temporal and spatial divides. In terms of temporality, I think that they were very aware of the permanency of these things. They're interacting with them in the lower St. John's. They're interacting with the Rollin shell ring. So they know that these things last thousands and thousands of years, and they kind of have a common origin in it. And then also, transcending the spatial divides and Mississippian beliefs, which they were engaging in to some extent. We see kind of this general concept of the axis mundi, which is the belief in the upper world, in this world, and then the underworld. And in a lot of Mississippian beliefs, the underworld is represented by the sea. So in Cedar Point North's case, they were taking these shells, which were represented as the underworld. They were building them on this world, but they were building them in alignment with things happening in the upper world. So all of these cosmological events. And again, we're seeing this on the broader scale in the region with them citing their mortuary monuments with the solstices. They're citing their mortuary monuments with these shell formations to the solstices. So we're kind of showcasing and uncovering more and more complex features and kind of really understanding all of these new things that were happening during the St. John's II period. So I would like to thank Keith Ashley and Ken Sassman. This project wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for Keith Ashley. This is, again, kind of an ongoing project, even though we may have finished field work at this site. We're keeping all of this in mind when we excavate in the future. I'm doing my dissertation on Mill Cove. I'm keeping it in mind with Mill Cove. All of these same things seem to be very well articulated with each other. And also thank you to the UNF students who are out there digging and kind of making this project possible as well. The National Park Service and then PASS for inviting me to talk. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
I have two questions. The circular formation, could that possibly be defensive works from raiding?
We don't see any evidence of raiding during this
Warfare?
time period.
No evidence of warfare?
No, we see that there were these smaller we call them Colorado period communities living in this area at the time. But we don't see any sort of warfare or violence go on when they migrated in. Interestingly, because we do think that the Colorado people were eventually assimilated. And this is my own hypothesis with no evidence to back this up. But there, near that grand shell ring, there is a small other shell midden that is dating to the Colorado period. And it's almost as if these new people came in and looked at that shell mound and said, well, we're going to build a gigantic ring right next to it and almost, assert their presence in this new area. But there's no evidence of warfare or raiding.
And my second question is, for the solstice, what did they use for a horizon for the solstice? Did they have an artificial horizon or were they high enough to see the ocean?
So actually,
About 3 feet elevation.
they were definitely, if you clear that area, which I don't think it would have been that hard for them to clear that, the Cedar Point North side doesn't have a lot of large trees or anything. It's mostly just small shrubbery. When you clear that, you can perfectly see the marsh and all of that. You can see the sunrise, perfectly if you clear all of that. So it's kind of right there for the.
So the marsh on the coastal marsh,
Yes.
coastal marsh was their horizon
Yeah.
for the event?
Mhm.
Now, I did learn that some native peoples created artificial horizons in
Oh,
order
really?
to determine the solstice.
Oh, I didn't hear about that before.
Not
That's very.
necessarily.
Where they couldn't have this is in a rainforest or something.
Right, yeah.
They get high enough and then they'd build an artificial horizon and use that artificial horizon to determine where the solstice was.
That's interesting. One of the things with a lot of St. John's II sites is they were targeting areas on bluffs or higher areas. And what's kind of funny about that is whenever I think there's always functional interpretations that if they build on a bluff, it's because they want to stay away from flooding and all of that. But now it could also be much more complex. The same with the Midden monument argument. It's not just like function and its significance. It could be all of these things combined. They could be targeting high bluffs so they could see the horizon and target the solstice as well as avoid flooding.
Could the major activity, seasonal activity be during the winter? Because I see the largest built up mounds are pointing to the southeast for the winter solstice sunrise.
So actually what we're currently trying to do right now, and we're still processing the data, is there's these really, really incredibly tiny shells that attach themselves to oysters. They're called impressed otostomes. And we can find them in the fine screening when we do those column samples. What you can do is you can actually measure them and then you can get oyster seasonality. Because these little impressed otostomes, they only have a lifespan of 1 year. And it's the same lifespan every year, so they have the same growth cycle. So what we can do is after we measure those, we can actually calculate whether or not they were harvesting these oysters in winter or in summer. And then once we process that data, we'll probably be able to say whether or not they were coming here more so during the winter versus the summer.
And a follow-up question is weather, storms. That area of Florida is famous for their northeasters.
Mhm.
And if you have a northwest to southeast mound structure, that would blunt the storm surge coming in off the water.
That's what that has been brought up before, and I could possibly see that with Eola, which is that 200-meter long one built up right along the marsh edge. But even though that may explain that one, I find it kind of difficult to think about for the other ones, because the other ones are hundreds of meters inland.
Yeah.
So they're dragging, not only are they dragging these oysters, most of those oysters are intertidal, which means that they're fully submerged underwater. So they're having to go pretty far out in the marsh to get some of these oysters.
Mhm.
And then they're hauling them hundreds of meters inland, I think, to very intentionally construct these things. Mhm.
Well, I lived on Black Hammer Island for about 8 years. And basically, you could see the rise on any part of the island.
Mhm.
I mean, you're really low, and then you've got all the basic islands out from there that would keep it from being too bloody.
Yeah, I don't think that they were flooded all that much. We don't see really any evidence of flooding. I do think that the highly wear and tear eroding quality of the pottery that we're finding is because they're probably leaving these pots out there. So they're probably making these pots, leaving them out there when they're not at the site, they're becoming heavily worn, and then they just break over time and they throw it in the shell heap. Mhm.
More comment, I noticed even with you, it's like almost apologetic since we talk about the solstice. And I would like to point out that solar timekeeping has been universal across this globe since people figured out how to do it.
Oh, yeah.
And any organized society needs to know when it's 5 days till Christmas. You cannot organize a society without knowing where you are on the calendar. So I don't think we need to be apologetic about it at all.
Oh, I'm not apologetic about the solstices. I just perhaps don't want to be maybe conflated with people saying it's aligned with Scorpio and Aries and all of that.
There's another way of determining a solstice by the height of the sun.
Mhm.
In the summer is real high, and in the winter solstice, it's real low. And you can, if you have a north-south line
Mhm.
to determine the time when the sun passes that line. And what the height of the sun is when it passes that line, you can determine solstice that way.
We also, I was talking to Ken Sassman about this. I was wondering how they were aligning all of these larger sites with the solstices that are so far apart from one. I mean, they're not too far apart, but they're not like the Cedar Point North where there's only 5 or 10 meters separating all of the shell formations. And he pointed me towards some ethnographies where there are indigenous people out there where the chief or the head of the group just kind of has this internal clock where they don't even have to cite anything, they just know that the solstice is in this direction. And then in other cases, they were likely lighting larger fires where they could see the black smoke and then citing a solstice that way for some things.
Organized.
The sizes of the vessels, have you been able to figure out, are they large cooking vessels, are they small cooking vessels? Does it indicate that maybe you have small family groups that are consuming oysters, or are they having large cooking parties and feasting? And insights on that?
So I've measured all of the orifices. Unfortunately, because of how heavily worn all of the pottery was, most of them don't measure more than 5%. So there's not a ton of data to go on, but the stuff that I did or was able to measure, it looks like it ranges from about 35 to 50. So medium to like smaller on the large end sized pots.
5 gallons.
Which, at least based on, David Halley, who has done a lot of orifice stuff. He said that generally cooking pots are about in the 30 to 40 centimeter diameter range. So that kind of fits in an average sized cooking pot. The larger ones may have been for larger groups coming. I'm not entirely sure if these, I mean, I think that these different communities, St. John's 2 communities were coming together at this place. I'm not sure if each shell formation may represent a different community or if it was more of a very communal experience where all of them were gathering at this place and kind of participating in a shared mounding activity.
Have you determined whether there was, anything worth exported from this area to the Heartland, Mississippi area, like, whelk shells or conch shells? And obviously, at Cahokia, they didn't want any oyster shells.
Right,
They wanted conchs and whelk shells.
we have, there's a lot of whelk shells in the Jacksonville area. And we find a lot of whelk shells at a lot of St. John sites. We don't find many at this one because I don't think they were living there year round, so they had no need to make whelk hammers for anything.
Well, maybe they were exporting. Maybe they were coming there to exploit that as a resource to ship off to trade.
I think that the whelk shells would be more so found near the beach areas, especially lightning whelks, which is primarily what the interior Mississippians really valued. And I would also think that they were exporting them or making shell beads at Mill Cove because they were exporting shell beads. We have no evidence of shell bead manufacture here. And then also shell beads were being made in Cahokia. They were shipping off whelks in larger forms. It seems like the shell bead production centers at places like Cahokia didn't start until a little later. So they were probably initially exporting just shell beads here, and it doesn't look like they were making them at Cedar Point North. It was probably Mill Cove that they were making them at.
So the bottom line is they were just coming there, certain times of the year to eat oysters and catfish.
But
Maybe wrong.
maybe I do think that it's probably a little more. I think that the practice of shell mounding and the fact that they've been engaging in 4,000-year-old shell mounds probably their entire life, it shaped their lifeways in the Middle St. John's. They built their mounds and they lived near these shell mounds. They buried their dead in these archaic shell mounds. Coming to northeastern Florida and seeing almost no shell architecture was probably a little alarming to them. And I think that there is no evidence that St. John's people engaged in shell mounding practices in the Middle St. John's. And they didn't need to because their whole lives kind of surrounded these existing archaic shell mounds. They come to this area, there's almost no archaic shell mounds. They probably wanted to imprint their homeland onto this. So I think it has more so to do with this shared identity.
Well, anybody that's camped out always looks for the high ground. And so these people were trying to build structures that would be comfortable for them and not be on the marsh. The mosquito where the water would come in at high tide.
Well,
You're always going to want to build up a place where your foundation of your home is going to be.
Well, they were living here.
Away from the mosquitoes.
They were
Pretty well, they were out there.
They were probably coming here for about 1 week at a time out of the year. And then they were going back to where they lived. And they didn't live on shell mounds in other places in northeastern Florida. They just lived on naturally high bluffs that they found.
Kind of like the Panama City of the area.
Well, now, I have to ask Guy Prentice, were there oyster shells in Cahokia? He did his film school there.
No, there's no.
All right, well, I'm sure that if there are more questions, you can come up and ask Vic afterwards. I would like to give you a polo shirt, a classy polo shirt that we will be able to wear proudly. And then it's a little. Before you all leave, I realized that I forgot to thank these two young ladies over here, recent FSC grads who have been big help to us in all of our trials and tribulations with technology.
Here.
And one other thing that I also neglected to mention is Sarah Van Beck, who's in the back, is a past member, and She is an amazing horticulturist and she has flowers and plants that she is more than willing to share. And you can go up and talk to her afterwards. She's given us some and they're just beautiful. And so thank you, Sarah. These are some zinnias that she just brought us this evening. So please see Sarah on your way out. I can't thank you enough for such a wonderful presentation, Vic. I very much look forward to seeing the next chapter for you. And since you're going to be looking at Mount Royal artifacts in our collection, you're going to owe us a copy of your dissertation. And I look forward to seeing that. So thank you so much. And if anybody has questions, I'm sure Vic is happy to answer them. Thank you all for a wonderful season, and we'll see you next year.
Two features on your maps, one was the railroad, obviously, but the other one. Right.